Hello, Fiona. How terrific it is to have you on Let's Talk. Thank you for coming in.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Lindsay. Thank you for inviting me.
I had to say, I was kind of riveted by your book, The Infinite Air, with its beautiful cover. I love this cover.
I love it too.
And I love the way her scarf goes, whipping across the back of the book as well. It's terrific.
It's beautifully 30s, but it's beautifully modern in the way that it's been done.
And it evokes that look that Jean Batten had, and which she cultivated in particular, didn't it? With the white hats or white helmet. She had a white flying helmet, didn't she?
Yes, and white flying suits, and she wore white silk.
Yes.
White silk dresses. Even when she had to jettison all sorts of things from her little planes.
Yes.
The gypsy moths at the beginning, she would always make sure that she might have to throw an axe or two overboard, but she'd always have her lipstick and a little white silk dress that she could pop on.
Which I suppose you could screw up and shove into a tiny corner,
so.
but she always looked the part.
Those were the important things.
She knew about image as well as about flying and navigation, didn't she?
Yes.
But what an extraordinary woman she was, born in a little house in Rotorua in 1909, was it? Yes,
that's
when
right.
Rotorua was just gravel roads. The two, Dad, the dentist, and Mum and the two older brothers, ordinary Kiwi family.
They were indeed, yes. She was born just across from Government Gardens in Rotorua. And I think that Mother had a very stylish approach to how they lived. Apparently the house was decorated beautifully in a nice Edwardian style. And Mother herself was very stylish. She's a very
handsome woman too. In the photos I've seen of her. Yes.
She had been an actress in her hometown of Invercargill, and she acted in Rotorua. She rode around Rotorua on a big white horse, wearing quite flamboyant clothes. So she was a character in her own right. And a driving force, I think, in the family.
Absolutely. No, right in the flyleaf, you mentioned that she pinned above baby Jean's cot a clipping or a photograph of Mr. Blériot, the Frenchman, who had just been the first man to fly the English Channel. And is this true?
Yes, it is.
So that's staggering.
Yes, he'd flown it 8 months earlier, and she was full of admiration for this feat. So the interest in aviation was right there at the beginning.
And so as a tiny baby, Jean would look up and see a biplane.
Whatever it was. So.
It's just terrific, isn't it? Because she was an amazingly successful woman, but her entire fame was squashed into 4 years of her life in the 1930s.
Yes, I think if you look at the whole trajectory of Jean's life, you need to look at her early life. That time in Rotorua was something of an idyll. It was a beautiful childhood until the family started to disintegrate, which they did. They were beginning to by the time that they left Rotorua. I always believe, from all my reading, that Nellie Batten really was very much in love with her husband. And I think that he cared for his children, but a lot. He loved Jean. He tried to help his sons when they had difficulties later in their life. But they just couldn't live together. He had problems. He had a straying eye, and that
We're hearing lots about straying eyes this week, but it has ever been thus, hasn't it, with a certain sort of guy?
Yes. Anyway, I think that if you look at that disintegration of the family, I think that the sorrows that would befall Jean over the years as people she loved died, it had to have some sort of effect on her. She aimed high to overcome a difficult early life because the idyll turned to sorrow. She and her mother finished up living in quite squalid boarding houses during World War I and afterwards, and they were dirt poor.
Yes.
I mean, I actually identify with that quite strongly because during World War II, my mother and I lived in boarding houses around Ponsonby, which wasn't a smart place. It wasn't a smart place then.
Now, this must have been an immensely difficult task to take on as a novelist, because Jean Batten's story is quite well known, especially for older New Zealanders, I suppose. And so the point of writing a novel is to have a plot which sort of runs along to an ending which you wait to find out, and yet a lot of the world already knows what her rather sad ending was. So how did you approach this whole task of taking a famous woman and making a fictional account of her life?
Well, I really wanted to know what made Jean Batten tick. I wanted to see her as a true human being. And so I think that there's a lot in my book that hasn't been revealed before. I lived in Rotorua, so I knew a lot of people who'd known the family. So I was able to do some research there. I also lived in Waipu, where she used to go and stay with one of her brothers, and she used to stay with a friend along the road from where my parents had a farm. So there are lots and lots of people,
little connections, yeah.
Little connections, and people who actually did know her, or else their parents knew her quite well. So it was a different way of going into the story, I think. And yes, there is that very tragic ending, but I deal with it in one page. Because I've started with the family, I really end with what happened to the family and the resolution of those various relationships, or failure to resolve them.
There's still Battens in New Zealand now, and her older brother had four children, I'm not quite sure, so are his descendants still alive and around in New Zealand?
Some of them are, yes.
And so did you talk to them? Or?
That's an interesting question. I think that they feel that they've lived with Jean's image for a long time and are quite reticent about her, yes.
Yeah. I guess for people who are only about 20 years old, the only thing they know about Jean Batten is that there's a street in downtown Auckland named after her, or they might know that Auckland's airport, is it still the Jean Batten International Airport, or did they drop her name from the airport?
I think it still is. There's a beautiful statue by Anthony Stones just across from the International Airport, and of course her last plane, her Percival Gull, is hangs inside the International Airport.
Is it still there? I looked for it recently and couldn't find it, but maybe it's on a corner where I didn't look.
It was there the last time I was there. Quite recently I've seen it there.
Right.
And there's a statue of her in the Rotorua Airport. So I think her name does resonate still. Yes.
And so it should, because I mean you've done such a lot of research, I could tell in looking at old newspapers and the media of the time, and the wonderful headlines like the Try Again Girl and things, because she had to try so hard to hit her first major goal, didn't she? The flight from England to Australia.
Yes, indeed, she did. She had several goes at that. There were three attempts on 2 planes.
Yes, and she crashed twice. I mean, she could have died on either of those incidents.
In the extraordinary time when she crashes in the desert.
Yes. Where was it, in Baluchistan or something?
Yes, in Baluchistan.
Yeah.
And she goes to sleep and she thinks, well, I have to make the best of it. I'll pull out some cushions and have a sleep in the desert. And she wakes up and there she is, surrounded by Baluchistani tribesmen.
Yes, who probably had never seen a white woman before, let alone an aeroplane, I suppose.
An aeroplane.
Yes.
And yet somehow she manages to persuade them to take her off to get parts for the plane, and she travels through the night. And I just think, what amazing courage.
Yes.
You will understand that to me she's a great heroine. I have enormous admiration for her. And I couldn't possibly have written about, spent 3 years of my life writing and researching somebody who I didn't admire tremendously.
Yeah, and she wrote 3 books herself, did she not? Which obviously you read as part of your research.
Yes.
What sort of a writer was she?
Look, the first one, Solo Flight, I think is a really underestimated little masterpiece. It was written after her successful flight to New Zealand in 1936. No, it was written before that, after she'd got to Australia, about the first 3 attempts. And I think it's a wonderful, vigorous, young woman's adventure story. The second book that she wrote, My Life, is not quite as spirited, and by that time the love of her life Beverly Shepherd had died, as had many of her fellow pilots, and it was republished as Alone in the Sky with some very minor alterations. I think it's a duller read, but there's a lot of stuff that's interesting there, and she is my primary source. You mentioned the newspapers before. Marvellous papers past, because now all of those there's so much that's now available which wasn't available when her biography was written in the 80s.
And we forget too in 2013 how difficult it must have been way back before World War II for a young woman to make a name for herself in a very male domain, and also because she and her mother both went to England where she did her flight training, although her father, who was funding them, didn't know that. But there was mention of, being referred to as colonials and things, and this sort of shameful thing of being a colonial in England back then. It was interesting that you brought that up.
The same sort of thing that Catherine Mansfield had really said of her, I think. But she went to the London Aero Club, and their club rooms were at Stag Lane, and there were all these extraordinary people who were there. I mean, the Prince of Wales was, there often, behaving badly and doing what his father, the King, said he shouldn't do, and getting drunk and being bundled into laundry vans and taken to the back entrance of Buckingham Palace. All of this is actually happened.
I know, and that's for this little girl from Rotorua. I was fascinated too by research which you must have unearthed about the number of other women who were learning to fly and being very active in that club at those days. And quite an aristocratic bunch, like the Duchess of Bedford and somebody called Lady Sophie Mary Heath, who fought a great battle to say it was all right for women to fly on commercial flights, because it was thought at the time that because women had periods they couldn't possibly do that.
And she contested, she challenged that and won. So Nellie, who was Jean's mother, who was certainly a feminist before her time, was very admiring of that and thought that this was a good reason for Jean to go there, because they supported the women's rights. And Amy Johnson was there too, of course, another great flyer, but also interestingly one who came from a very poor background. Her father ran a fish shop. He'd been very supportive of her becoming a flyer.
You evoke with a lot of tenderness how difficult it must have been for Jean in those days to one by one hear these stories of people that she knew, like Amy Johnson and Giles Kingsford Smith, and people who flew off into the boondocks and were never heard of again. And yet still she wanted to get in her plane and fly across the world. I mean, took guts.
Yes, I think that those series of tragedies, I think, had a cumulative effect, and this is really what my book is saying, is that if you take her childhood and then the success to overcome it, and then these sorrows one after the other, and then Beverly Shepherd, who was the young Australian pilot who she fell so deeply in love with, his death, I think, made it much harder. And then she went back to England. She tried to get over it, and was living a high old social life. And
burying herself, no doubt, in dinner parties and champagne and being famous.
Absolutely, yes, and being invited to supper by the King and Queen, and being chatted up by King Leopold of Belgium, and all of those things. And then her plane was taken away. Before World War II, she'd volunteered to fly. Yeah,
that was an interesting episode, wasn't it? Because she was in Sweden as the war broke out and was advised not to fly back to England, and yet somebody pulled strings and she was the last person to fly right across Germany with permission from the German authorities.
Yes, that's right.
And you tend to indicate that possibly when she volunteered to fly for the RAF, it might have mitigated against her, or that there was some sort of suspicion.
I have that feeling, because she was staying with this man, Axel Wenner Gren, who was famous for inventing Electroluxes, as it happened. But he rang his friend Goring. He was and Wenner Gren. She behaved very naively. I don't know whether it was because she was trying to live her life in an excessive way and to put pain to one side, but it was a foolish mistake. And when she arrived in England, she was met by the War Office. And I think there's no absolute proof, but one has to assume that that this had contributed to it. And I've seen some of the letters that the War Office sent her, and the first ones that they sent her were very enthusiastic. You know, how wonderful.
Yes.
And then over a period of months, you just see that the letters tail off.
Yeah.
And
how tragic it was that a woman with all of her piloting and navigation skills was working in a munitions factory,
That's
for
right,
heaven's sake,
yes.
and driving ambulances.
Yes.
And in fact, that flight was her very last one, I understand.
It was, yes. So the plane was impressed, they call it. In other words, taken away from her.
It's amazing it survived the war, really,
Well,
and that it now hangs at Auckland Airport.
I know,
Yes.
that's rather wonderful though,
Yes.
I think.
You used some lovely language, and I wondered if she wrote in a lyrical sort of way about being in the air. At one stage you talk about looking down and seeing great numbers of flamingos creating a ribbon of scarlet tulle across the sky. Is that the sort of way she would have written, or is this pure Fiona Kidman?
She did in solo flight. She has some quite lyrical writing in it, and at the end I acknowledge that some of the phrases are hers, but I've got a passion for flamingos, so that's pure Fiona Kidman. Yes, I popped the flamingos in. Yes, I was in. I went to the Camargue last year because I like white horses and flamingos, so I went and saw them, and they were so exquisite and so beautiful. I thought I need to pop them into the book somewhere.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, before we came into the studio, you were telling me that it's 77 years yesterday since Jean.
Today.
Okay.
Yesterday.
Since
yes, that's right. Yesterday.
Since Jean landed at Auckland Airport on that very first flight.
Yes, that's right.
From
the 17th of October.
England
1936.
to New Zealand, yes.
She was the first woman, not just the first woman, but the first person to fly from England to New Zealand.
And I was blown away by the speech given by the mayor on that occasion, who said, "Jean, you're a very naughty girl, and really I think you need a good spanking for causing us so much anxiety." I mean, my jaw dropped. You know, this woman was astonishing, a mature woman with enormous skills, and she's been ticked off like an 8-year-old.
Doesn't that encapsulate the whole sort of thing that she had to overcome, though? That this, in her home country, that this was still the prevalent attitude. There had been immense opposition in Sydney to her making the last leg of the flight, although the Tasman had been flown by a number of men. No woman had flown it, and they were saying, well, isn't that enough? In fact, the Governor-General's wife wrote an open letter to her in the Sydney Morning Herald saying,
"Don't go!"
Woman to woman was the headline.
Yes.
Woman to woman, I implore you not to go.
Wow, yeah.
And then so she stepped down as she left. She got back out of her plane and she said to the people who were on the ground, she said, "I want it known that I am making this flight of my own volition," or words to that effect, and I want no one to come and look for me.
Should I go down in the sea? Don't come and look for me.
Don't come and look for me, because that was one of the arguments, was that she was going to create, people would have to pay a lot of money to go and look for her.
It's so astonishing, isn't it, when you think the big movie of the moment is Gravity with Sandra Bullock as an astronaut. Have you seen it?
No, not yet.
It's really, really worth seeing, actually. And when you think it's only 80 years since Jean Batten was, doggedly flying across the Atlantic Ocean with the control column between her knees, 12 hours desperately looking for land and things. And to the 80 years later, it's common for women to be up there spinning around the Earth 15 times a day,
Yes,
and how amazing it is that technology has roared on so fast. And she was a pioneer in all of that.
She was, and she was a very good navigator. I mean, I think that she and Christopher Columbus would have got on really well. If people ask me who I'd like to have to dinner, as they do in some of those columns, I'd say I'd like to have Jean Batten and Christopher Columbus at the dinner just to talk about navigation skills.
Wouldn't it be astonishing?
Quite extraordinary.
Yes.
And Louis Blériot was very admiring. He said, you must be one of the greatest navigators the world has ever seen.
It's when you think how scant the help was that they had up there. I think you point out that she got into her gypsy moth for her first expedition to Australia, and all she had was an airspeed indicator, engine revolution counter, altimeter, and a kind of spirit bubble thing on the dashboard so that she could tell whether she was straight and level or not. And that was it. A torch, a compass, and just sheer dead reckoning skills, I guess.
Well, it took me a bit to get my head around all the technology. Fortunately, my husband is a plane buff and you know, loves planes. He learned to fly during his compulsory military training in tiger moths, which are just one jump
very similar to a gypsy moth.
Gypsy moth, yes.
And none of us can now understand how heart-stopping it must be to take off over an ocean and hope that you're pointed in the right direction and be waiting and waiting and waiting for the sight of land on the horizon. I mean, I just can't imagine how horrendous that would be.
Well, she writes often in her logbook, I'm very lonely. And in a way, that's one of the other keys to her personality, because the idea that she was sort of superhuman, superwoman, that she didn't have any deeply felt emotions, that she would say over and again, I'm so lonely now. And yet I believe that she came to terms with solitude, and I think that towards the end of her life, solitude was actually her solace. People say how tragic that she was on her own, but I think that by that stage that was something she had chosen, and I think that she learned it up there in the starry, starry sky.
Yes. And of course, those who know her story know that her death was caused by a dog bite. And you very cleverly weave in a kind of a fear and an apprehension of dogs through that script.
Bit of fiction there. I mean, there's a lot of fiction there.
Well, it's a novel, isn't it?
Yes, it is a novel, yes. And I mean, I don't know everything that everybody said, and I don't, as nobody can.
Yes, of course. You indicate some possible difficulty with brothers during her childhood as well. There's a sort of a feeling of oppression without being very clear. So do you imagine that something might have occurred in her childhood that gave her difficulty with relationships thereafter? Because she did struggle to find the right men, didn't she?
I think her brothers were people who had difficulties with life, and I think that Jean lived apart from them from a very early age, and I really wouldn't want to comment any further than I have in the book about.
And there was one who was a silent movie actor that I had no idea about.
Yes, Jean Batten, and he was also a radio announcer here in Auckland for years. But he was in Hollywood. He made a lot of movies and made a lot of money. Lost it all in the stock market crash. Went to England and was the star of Under the Greenwood Tree.
Yeah, so he was a pretty astonishing character as well.
Yes, and he continued to make some movies for the war effort during World War II.
Yes. So. Now, this is your 25th, 26th, I've lost track of the number of books that you've written. Yes.
I don't know.
Yes. But this has been a particularly good week for literature for women, hasn't it? With Eleanor Catter's win in the Man Booker Prize.
Stunning. Yes. Absolutely wonderful. A lovely young woman who's got a great future ahead of her, but to be so far along the track and at such an early stage of it, it's wonderful. I'm very excited for her.
And it's terrific, isn't it, that Hokitika, of all places, will now become a place on the map of the world, won't it? Oh, because nobody in England or around the Commonwealth or anywhere will ever have heard of Hokitika, where her book is based. So it's amazing what fiction can do to popularise a place.
Indeed. She's also shortlisted for the Governor-General's Award because she was born in Canada. So she and I will both be in Toronto for the Harbourfront Festival next week.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So that'll be nice to.
And you have
catch
your
up with her.
own string of honours, of course, you know, many fellowships and awards over the years, including the wonderful French awards that you received, the French Order of Arts and Letters and the French Legion of Honour. Did you ever think that when you were in your mid-20s that you might be the person you are today?
I never thought in my mid-60s or 60s that I would have the French Legion of Honour, and it astonishes me, and it's one of the things that Jean had too.
Yeah. Oh well,
It's just so especially nice.
That's amazing, isn't it? That's yet another link between the two of you.
It is a link, but when I started out to write, I just wanted to write. I was passionate about my desire to write, and I had been a young librarian, as I think I mentioned, and I wanted to have a book with my name on it someday.
You looked at all of those thousands of books on the shelf and thought, I can do that too.
I couldn't really have imagined that 50 years later I'd be doing this or sitting talking to you. Or a lot of things that I've done.
That's very wonderful. Well, may the infinite air take off and fly the way it should. Thank you so much for being here, Dame Fiona Kidman.